The latest number of how many Greek New Testament manuscripts we have as of 3 weeks ago is 5,824. And that's because of my Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. We have a table out in the back. You can get some in the lobby. You can see some of the brochures. I encourage you to just take a look at it to see what we're working on. We have been photographing and discovering manuscripts throughout the world. Take high-resolution digital photographs. And 3 weeks ago, we got the news from an institute in Germany that is the official cataloger of all Greek New Testament manuscripts. And the latest 11 manuscripts that we've discovered, they have now given official catalog numbers to. So that brings the number to 5,824. Now, I'll give you some more information that's not in that catalog, and that is there's about 30 more manuscripts. They still are behind on cataloging. So we're looking at about 5,855, something like that. That's a lot of manuscripts. By the way, the average-sized Greek New Testament manuscript is more than 450 pages long. We're not talking about little fragments. Yes, there are some that are little fragments, and there are some that are huge manuscripts, but the average size is over 450 pages. The New Testament was translated into various languages as well early on. Latin swept across Western Europe, and starting in the 2nd century, the New Testament was translated into Latin. We have more manuscripts in Latin than we do in Greek, and we're not sure exactly what the count is, but we know it's over 10,000. It was then translated into other ancient languages, Syriac and Coptic, Armenian, and Georgian and Gothic and Old Church Slavonic, Arabic. The list goes on and on. Our best guess is that there are at least 5,000 manuscripts in these other ancient translations, and as many as 10,000. In fact, that's really a conservative guess. They just haven't been all tabulated. And when I have debated Dr. Ehrman, we've had 3 debates, I give him these figures. He's never disputed them because he knows that I'm underestimating what the numbers actually are. But if you had a magic wand and you could just wipe out all of these manuscripts in one fell swoop, would we be left without a witness? Would we have no idea what the New Testament said? No. And that's because of church fathers, scholars, priests, patriarchs, bishops, elders who wrote commentaries on the New Testament, and they wrote homilies, sermons. And these men did not have the gift of brevity. We have, to date, counted more than 1 million quotations of the New Testament by these church fathers. Now, the New Testament itself has just under 8,000 verses in it. And for these church fathers to quote it more than 1 million times, how much do they quote each time? Sometimes part of a verse, sometimes a whole verse, sometimes more than that. But that's an awful lot of quotations. We could reproduce virtually the entire New Testament many, many times over just on the basis of the quotations by the church fathers. It's a remarkable number. Now, how does this compare with other ancient literature? Now you're starting to get a picture of, wow, we got a lot of manuscripts for the New Testament. The average classical Greek writer has less than 20 copies of his work still in existence. And frankly, that's an extremely high estimate. You only have a handful of Greek authors who have 20 copies, handwritten copies of their texts that still exist. But I like to use that number because when I debate skeptics, they can't dispute it at all. You stack these up, and they'd be about 4 feet high, so it'd come up right up to the podium. Now, how high do you think the stack of New Testament manuscripts would be? Let's not count the quotations from fathers. I have no idea how to do that. But let's look at the Greek texts and versions, just like we are with these classical authors. Might be as tall as my head, you think? A little taller than that? Maybe as tall as the ceiling? Some of you are skeptical. Well, here's what it looks like. This is going to take all day. Yeah, it's a little better. Maybe there's more New Testament. Oh, here we go. Some more manuscripts. That's getting there. That looks pretty good. That's as much as I can do in PowerPoint. You multiply that stack by 8. And it's going to be more than 1 mile high. The New Testament manuscripts, compared to classical authors, 4 feet, over 1 mile high. We have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the text. And when we talk about that, here's the thing you need to understand. Skeptics will say, how can you possibly tell what the New Testament originally said? It's been translated and copied so many times, we don't know. Yes, but we're not relying just on the latest versions of it. We can go back in time and we can see earlier copies and we can see many, many, many copies. If we're going to be skeptical about what the New Testament originally said, that skepticism on average, needs to be multiplied at least 1,000 times for any other classical Greek or Latin author. Herodotus was the historian of Alexander the Great. Suetonius was one of the 3 historians on the Caesars. If we don't have the New Testament text, or if we have doubts about that, we should be 1,000 times more skeptical about these other texts. Maybe Julius Caesar really never existed. Maybe there never was an Alexander the Great. Let's play fair with the evidence. The New Testament is phenomenal in terms of how much we've got in manuscripts. But it's also earlier than these other texts. We're not waiting for hundreds of years to see these copies. We're actually waiting decades for the New Testament. Let me just give you some illustrations. Greco-Roman authors, Pliny the Elder, these are all historians and biographers, so the kind of literary genre they are is like the New Testament. Pliny the Elder, about the time of the New Testament, we're waiting 700 years. 700 years before we get the first copy, and we have, I think, about 20 copies of it. Plutarch, we're waiting 800 years. Josephus, you've heard of him. His Antiquities of the Jews mentions Jesus, James, his brother, John the Baptist, and he mentions Herod Agrippa II, who died of worms when he accepted praise as deity, mentioned in the book of Acts by Luke. We're waiting 800 years before we see a single copy of Jewish antiquities. That's pretty sobering. Polybius, we're waiting 1,200 years, does some fascinating biographies. Pausanias dealt with the geography of Greece, 1,400 years before we see a single copy. And Pausanias' text, we've got gaps that are so massive, we don't know what he says for 3 or 4 chapters at a pop. Herodotus, one of the 2 great historians, one of the 2 original historians on which we base our understanding of historiography, of how to do history properly. We're waiting 1,500 years before we get the first substantial copies of Herodotus. He was the biographer of Alexander the Great. Xenophon's Hellenica, 1,800 years before we get any substantial copies. Now think about that. It's a great illustration to use. Xenophon, Hellenica. Scholars say this is essentially what Xenophon wrote. Yeah, we've got some questions, but the skepticism isn't as rampant as it would be with the New Testament. But if we were waiting as long for any substantial copies of the New Testament as classical scholars have to wait for Xenophon, that means the New Testament copies that we have, the earliest copies we would have, would be written, about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Is anybody going to think that that's going to go back to the original? Well, let's play fair with the evidence. Look at these other scholars. These are some of the more prominent historians. And yet, we're waiting hundreds and hundreds of years to see any copies. Let me talk to you about the date of New Testament manuscripts. In the first millennium, up until the year AD 1000, we have about 15% of our New Testament manuscripts. That's hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts. But let's go back in time and say, well, do we have any in the first 500 years? The average classical author is waiting 500 years at least before we get any of his copies. The New Testament, we have the whole thing completely in multiple copies within the first 300 years. In multiple copies. Let me talk to you about the discovery of P-52, which was not a prototype of a fighter plane after the P-51 Mustang. Is that the only manuscript we have from the 2nd century, from between AD 100 and 200? No. We have as many as a dozen manuscripts from that era. And then it starts increasing until we get to the 4th century. We have about 121 New Testament manuscripts with the whole New Testament multiplied many times over.